Hello students, welcome to the EPG Pathshala. I'm Aparna from IIT Bombay, and today we are going to talk on module of migration and the Indian city from paper Sociology of Urban Transformation. After completing this module, you should be able to understand, to assess the scale of rural to urban migration and its contribution to urban India. Should be able to understand major paradigms of rural to urban migration, to highlight the salience of circular migration, streams, and forms of rural-urban circulation. Should be able to understand the connection between migration and the urban informal economy, and also to consider some themes in connection with neoliberal transformations in contemporary India. Rao offers the following definition and types of migration. Quote, migration is a shift in the place of residence for some length of time. While it excludes short visits and tours, it includes different types of both voluntary and involuntary movements. Examples of involuntary movements are migration under such crises as war, transfer of population, riots, floods, droughts, and earthquakes. It also includes marriage migration, birilocal, exorilocal or neolocal migration, and transfer migration. There are other situations of migration where movement is part of people's earning a livelihood. And these are nomads, shifting cultivators, traders and salesmen, artisans and laborers. Economists view rates of rural to urban migration in India as being very low compared to other developing countries. Over the 40 years from 1961 to the year 2001, rural males between the age group 25 to 49, the economically productive age groups, only migrated at rates ranging from 4% to 5.4%. Using comparable data for India and Brazil, Brazil's migration rate was 39.9%, and it was more than twice that of India's migration, which is 5.3%. Dimensions of rural-urban migration. Rural to urban migration is one of the main components of urban growth in India. Bhagat and Mohanty decomposed urban growth into four discrete components. A. Natural population increase. B. Net migration into urban areas. C. Net reclassification of settlement as towns. And D. Extension of urban center boundaries. Bhagat provides a number of 101 million or over 10 crore migrants in urban India in 2001 census data. According to the 2010 NSS data, in-migrants comprise 35% of the population of urban areas. Furthermore, employment-related reasons explain as much as 60% of all rural to urban migration. Together with rural-urban reclassification, accounted for 50% of urban population growth over the period of between 2001 to 2011. Overall, net rural to urban migration contributed almost 20.8% of urban growth over the period of between 1991 to 2001. Migration contributed a high of 36% of urban growth in Gujarat, followed by Maharashtra and Haryana. Mohanty and Bhagat also analyzed migration data over the period between 1971 to 2001 and found that growth rate of interstate migrants of 0 to 9 years duration in 1991-2001 was a whopping 66.5%. These authors thus concluded that the most important fact emerging from the analysis of the components of urban growth of major states is that the less urbanized states are growing mostly through natural decrease, whereas the contribution of migration continues to be higher in more urbanized states, though even in these states it contributes not more than 1/3 of urban growth. Using census data, Bhagat also provides a breakup of the share of all immigrants in million-plus cities. This number ranged from a low of about 15% in Agra and Allahabad to 45% in major metros such as Delhi and Mumbai to 55% or more in Ludhiana and Surat. According to census data, no more than 35% of all migrants find regular or salaried employment, and as many as 30% are casually employed. These numbers point to the pivotal link between migration and the urban informal economy, discussed in later sections. Temporary migrations. According to Bhagat, when it comes to seasonal and temporary migration, 63% goes towards urban centers. The pioneering anthropological accounts by Jane Berman provided a decades-long longitudinal view of circular migration in rural Gujarat. Even though they are expected to be significant both in India and elsewhere, very little is known about the impacts of these migration streams on urban informal markets. Policy reviews such as Deshinkar and Sabat's, Wheeler, and Waddington rely on work on sending areas conducted within policy-oriented or regional settings. The 64th round of NSS data broadened the definition of temporary migration. It defines temporary migration as staying away from the village or town for a period of 30 days to 6 months. This yields a richer portrait of short-term migration patterns. However, it suggests that only about 30.5 million workers in the period between 2001 to 2008 fall under this category. In comparison to informal estimates derived from primary studies, these numbers are believed to be undercounts of the true magnitudes. As Srivastava and Shashikumar suggested, the major data source on population mobility in India, that is, the census and the National Sample Survey, underestimate temporary, seasonal, and circulatory migration. Scholars opine that using the categories of population mobility, it's difficult to measure worker mobility. As rural and urban economies become even more interlinked, migration has become a complex process and it has acquired a multidimensional characters. We may even ask, how do these migration streams impact particular cities? In the absence of such disaggregated data in India, a sense of the magnitudes involved can be obtained from a Southeastern Asian study. Thailand's National Migration Survey estimates can help us streamline data. Sood argues that if estimates of the scale of circular migration remain vague, then micro-studies have to be more attentive to the phenomenon of temporary migration. From a policy perspective, the importance of occupational and geographic mobility, particularly temporary and commuter migration in the livelihood diversification strategies of the poor, is only now being recognized. Even in countries in Southeast Asia and Africa, where the importance of temporary migration streams have received attention or are to remarkable neglect, available empirical and analytical perspectives focus on sending areas, and many of these studies shed important light on the motivations of temporary migrants and on their mobility patterns. For instance, Lucas' study in 2003 considers how target saving compares as an economic explanation for circular migration, and it offers an analytical approach to understanding the stimulation's choice of location for living and for working. In India, Banerjee has outlined the importance of chain and serial migration movements, which is characterized by interactions between migration and destination-based contexts, especially as it pertains to labor migrants. So what are the reasons to migrate? Why do people migrate? What are the push and pull factors that instigate people to migrate?
It is useful here to retreat and consider some of the factors that drive migration. Yudvani and Sivaramakrishnan describe two major paradigms of migration. The marginalist or dual economy attributes migration to wage differentials between the two sectors. One, rural or traditional or low wage, and the other, urban or modern or high wage. On the other hand, Marxist models view temporary migrants as a surplus labor pool used by dominant groups to drive down wages and weaken the possibility of collective action. In contrast, Yudvani and Sivaramakrishnan see migration as a social and cultural process, not merely an economic one. In this perspective, cyclical migration may occur because it can allow agents to loosen and occasionally repudiate institutionalized forms of authority and control that are exercised through the rural labor process. This theorization views migrants as vectors of ideas and political sensibilities, from the urban to the rural and vice versa. One implication of their work is also that the correlation between economic insecurity and tendency to migrate is not quite direct. Instead, migration can become a political act of protest against agrarian inequalities. Shah's work on Adivasi migrants in Jharkhand similarly shows that migration is far from an economic decision alone. Shah says that to escape the social constraints of village life, migrants brave the difficult housing and working conditions at the brick kilns around the highly urbanized Hooghly district of West Bengal. In fact, many villagers prefer to migrate even though they could earn more at home. Mose follows the migrations of Bhil Adivasis from the rural tribal communities of the borderlands of South Rajasthan, Western Madhya Pradesh, and Eastern Gujarat. Mose estimates that as of 1996 and 1997 survey, about 65% of households in 42 villages were involved in seasonal migration for informal work, primarily in the urban construction sector in centers such as Surat, Vadodara, and Ahmedabad. The recruiters led the migrants through clearly delineated migration pathways to the same destinations year after year. Mose also offers a richly detailed account of these journeys, showing how migration networks get built. The authors have identified three distinct recruitment systems. First, enterprising migrants travel to nearby towns and hire themselves out at local nakas or informal labor markets. In the second, families or kin groups, including young women with their direct connection to hiring builders, travel together. In the third case, the poorest and least connected migrants are hired directly from villages by muqaddams or labor brokers who had often themselves migrated and now settled in cities as supervisors or moneylenders. These muqaddams negotiate the terms and cash advances with urban employees and took these gangs of migrants long distances at weak terms and poor recompense. In such case, the agency of migrant was the lowest with this type of migration. Let's talk about migration and the urban informal economy. The most influential and wide-ranging study of circular migration in India has been offered by Dutch anthropologist Jan Berman's work on the Adivasi Halpatis of South Gujarat, who travel from their villages to the largest nearby city of Surat. After a research program started in the early 1960s, Berman found that agricultural work had ceased to be the main income source for village households by the mid-1980s. And even according to the 2011 census, Surat was one of the top 10 cities in India by population, second in Gujarat only to Ahmedabad. And despite the presence of a large corporate such as Reliance, Larsen & Toubro, and Esso, as well as ONGC and IOC, Surat's economy and landscape are dominated by the informal sector and slums. However,
transient workers and migrants depend on makeshift shelter living in temporary roadside juggies, workplace dormitories, buildings under construction, factory sheds. And Berman estimates that for 10 to 15% of the labor force, the workplace doubles as living space. Similarly, slums are manufacturing and trading centers as much as residential areas. Meanwhile, the high-end informal enclaves remain out of reach for migrant workers. And interestingly, Berman in 1996 argues that the vast majority of industrial labor in Surat consists of migrants. Berman terms this as a footloose proletariat. The industries in which they find semi-permanent work include textiles and diamond artilleries. Turnover in these industries is high, and employers will dismiss workers summarily with little explanation. Furthermore, as Berman notes, that urban employment in the informal sector is marked by a cyclicality that is usually associated with an agrarian rural economic lifestyle. Thus, there is a little concept of leave. The employees who take days off for sickness or travel lost their jobs. Starting with the work of Berman, migration streams into urban Gujarat have been the subject of a relatively large pool of studies. Joshi and Khandelwal study of 2009 traces the migration trajectories from Rajasthan's Godgunda block in Gujarat's urban textile markets. Hired through labor contractors, often as child workers, these migrants find work in yarn mills, looms, cloth mills, and textile markets in cities such as Surat, where they live in dingy conditions and are for long job hours. Moses et al. Studies on Adivasi migrants also faced extremely harsh conditions at their destinations at subsistence wages, and women and children suffer the most. These authors argue that the available legal protections fall woefully short in the face of specific circumstances of Adivasi migrants in the construction sector. For one, many of the labor laws, such as minimum wage, are geared to formal modes of employment. And second, Adivasi migrants lack institutional and social access to the informal apparatus and the labor offices. And this was also true for healthcare, municipal, and urban development authorities, who viewed these migrants as a nuisance. Moreover, even labor unions remained unattuned to the unique challenge of migrant Adivasi workers. An interesting and ironic phenomenon is the employment of Adivasi workers on contracted public works projects, often wages far below the legal minimum. According to these authors, the lack of a political collective is the fundamental difficulty facing migrant workers, as much as their reliance on the very agents that seek to exploit them, the muqaddams, builders, and the Naka. Some reasons why collective action among migrant workers is so difficult, and also suggested by Rao, is inter-ethnic relations, and they are at a critical issue in urban migration, because ethnicity determines co-location and patterns of segregation, and as well as collective action in Indian cities. Moreover, Marxist theories of migration suggest the possibility of labor market competition between migrants and local residents. So all of these processes serve to fragment migrant and non-migrant communities. Rural cosmopolitanism and rural-urban circulation. Drawing on a broad array of case studies from West Bengal, Tamil Nadu, and Gujarat, as well as the work of authors such as Jan Berman, Gidwani, and Shivaram Krishnan, argue that circular migration has been a long-standing element of the survival strategies developed by Dalits and Adivasis, especially in dryland areas. These authors view such migrants as representatives of a rural cosmopolitanism. The migrants straddle between two different cultures,
two different cultural words with great facility but with more hardship. Gidwani and Shivaram Krishnan agree that poorer migrants may have a specially circumscribed access to the city, but also highlight the ways in which the migration transforms the political consciousness of disadvantaged and Dalit communities. These authors contrast the plebeian cosmopolitans, such as the domestic workers who migrate between Chennai and their homes in surrounding villages, and the patrician cosmopolitans who retain a foothold in the city and the village. Gidwani and Shivaramakrishnan contend that circular migration bridge the divide between the space of conventionally urban and rural. Jodhkar's work, which focused on two Haryana villages on the periphery of the national capital region, also reveals the spatial form of the rural-urban continuum. Many of his respondents commented to nearby urban centers even while continue to live in the villages. Many Dalits in this study, almost 28%, had regular or government jobs outside. Jodhkar concludes, quote, choosing to live in the village did not imply any kind of commitment to or identification with the village and its ethos. The social order of caste hierarchy is a thing of past, and the collective identity of village is nearly completely fragmented. Stop. Slide 9. Exclusionary urbanization. In contrast to studies which gesture the emergence of a rural-urban continuum, Kundu has contended that urban planning and development in Indian cities are systematically biased against rural migrants, and this limits the absorption capacity and growth potential of urban centers. Kundu also describes exclusionary urban growth as resulting from a negative policy perspective on migration and increased unaffordability of land and basic amenities by the rural poor, which leads to deceleration in urban growth. Kundu argues for a declining trend of urbanization based on data on the urban-rural growth differential, that is, the difference between the growth rate of urban population and that in rural population. This analysis suggests that the new jobs in globalizing India are more easily accessed by high-skilled and better-off workers, leaving the large majority of poorer workers behind. Further, even short-duration migration opportunities in urban areas are being concerned. Stop. मैं फिर से बोलूंगी यहाँ से इसको डिलीट कर दो. Further, exclusionary urbanization. In contrast to studies which gesture the emergence of a rural-urban continuum, Kundu has contended that urban planning and development in Indian cities are systematically biased against rural migrants, and this limits the absorption capacity and growth potential of urban centers. Kundu also describes exclusionary urban growth as resulting from a negative policy perspective on migration and increased unaffordability of land and basic amenities by the rural poor, which leads to deceleration in urban growth. Kundu argues for a declining trend of urbanization based on data on the urban-rural growth differential, that is, the difference between the growth rate of urban population and that in rural population. This analysis suggests that the new jobs in globalizing India are more easily accessed by high-skilled and better-off workers, leaving the large majority of poorer workers behind. Further, even short-duration migration opportunities in urban areas are being cornered by somewhat better-off sections of the population, as in case of general migration. Kundu suggests that urban economies as well as governance in India's metropolises are unfavorable to poorer migrants and instead select for the migrants from higher socio-economic status backgrounds. Poor rural migrants face a variety of informal entry barriers in the most successful Class 1 cities, which are in an exclusionary and sanitizing mode. For example, the push for infrastructure mega projects leads to massive displacement of slum populations. Yet, the politics in these cities remain hostile to the most disadvantaged rural migrants. From a policy perspective, thus Kundu advocates greater investment and support to small and medium towns to help absorb migrants fleeing a declining agrarian sector into the non-agricultural employment. Migrants in the neoliberal city. Son of the soil argument of the type deployed by the Shiva Sena and MNS in Mumbai are political tool to deny the migrants' right to the city. The lack of identifying documents, the inability to vote, missing access to housing also serve to compound this denial. A response to Bhagat's question, does the migrant have a right to city, comes in a recent collection in the EPW. Samadhir complicates the paradigm of exclusionary urbanization. According to Samadhir, the contradiction of a neoliberal city lies in the fact that the migrant can neither be removed from nor settled in the city. Jha and Kumar's contribution, which characterizes the state as one of the suspended citizenship, illustrates this tension best. On the one hand, rural migrants serve as a cheap source of labor for informal garment units in places like Dharavi in Mumbai's informal economy. While on the other hand, migrants in such scenarios of vulnerable employment find themselves rendered homeless. The precariousness faced by the homeless is further compounded because migrants' claim to public space is itself subject to contestation and repudiation by middle class and elite civil society actors. Monishri Vyas similarly looks at the figure of elderly security guard. The narratives of the security guards, many of whom have often migrated to Mumbai at a young age, reveal in stark detail how a life of precarity in jobs without labor protection compromises the migrants' long-term prospects, leaving them vulnerable to low-paid and exploitative work the twilight of their lives. Vyas concludes, quote, the lives of these security guards emphasize the connection between poverty, informal work, and precarity and its persistence across time and generation. Quote unquote. According to Samadhir, transit labor represents the neoliberal city's combination of the most virtual and primitive forms of accumulation. Its iconic image of the countless transit workers who construct New India's special economic zones, power plants, airports, railway corridors, highways, bridges, new towns and new buildings and houses, flyovers, information and technology parks, and other residential and commercial projects, themselves shelter in temporary hovels during close to construction projects. As Samadhir asserts, the neoliberal city, in order to be a logistical hub, becomes an extraction site. The figure of the migrant embodies the contradictions between the percept and the practice of right to the city.
Let's summarize what we have learned in this module. This module has presented studies on a selection of themes from the vast panoply of migration studies, and most important, it is evident that circular forms of labor migration rather than a depopulation of rural areas in favor of the urban predominant in Indian cities, even though, as Sood has argued, these circular migrants often remain undercounted. India's circular migrants and the commuters comprise a vast labor force of invisible workers. They spark construction booms and urban growth, but rarely, if ever, wait to be counted by the census taker. The makeshift settlements where they congregate often elude household surveys. These patterns of temporariness allow for various forms of circulation along the rural-urban continuum, even though many of these migrants remain in the informal economy, where in the absence of lack of collective action, they face lifetimes of precariousness in the neoliberal Indian city. Thank you.